Imagine. You wake up one morning in Tehran. You check your phone. The price of rice has doubled overnight. Again. Your salary, if you even have a job, buys half of what it bought last month. The government just announced they're removing subsidies on bread. Meat has become a luxury item your family can't afford. Your life savings, held in Iranian rials, are now worth less than the paper they're printed on. The currency has collapsed so badly that $1 now buys over 1 million rials. 1 million. Welcome to Iran in 2026. This is life in the most sanctioned nation on earth. A country that was once one of the wealthiest in the Middle East, producing 6 million barrels of oil per day under the Shah, now struggles to feed its population of 86 million people. But here's what most people miss when they talk about Iran's economic collapse. This isn't just about sanctions. And it's definitely not just about oil. This is the story of how a sophisticated Persian economy, home to one of the world's oldest civilizations, sitting on the fourth largest proven oil reserves and second largest gas reserves on the planet, descended into an economic nightmare that combines the worst of hyperinflation, systematic corruption, energy crisis, and survival through one of the most elaborate shadow economies ever constructed. Let's start at the beginning. Before we understand the collapse, we need to understand what Iran lost. Rewind to the 1970s. Iran under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was riding the greatest oil boom in its history. Between 1973 and 1977, after the Arab oil embargo quadrupled crude prices, Iran's oil revenues exceeded $1 trillion in today's money. That's about $5,000 per person per year, staggering wealth for a developing nation. The Shah went on a spending spree. Modern airports, hospitals, universities, military equipment from the United States. Iran's GDP grew at 13.2% annually. The middle class exploded. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, from 5,000 in universities in 1967 to over 74,000 by 1978. Tehran looked like it was becoming the Paris of the Middle East. But there was a problem. The boom masked deep structural rot. Most of the wealth concentrated in Tehran and a few major cities. The countryside saw almost nothing. Income inequality was grotesque. The Shah himself became the richest man in the country by confiscating land and businesses. Industrial growth was unbalanced and fragmented, dependent almost entirely on imported goods flooding through overwhelmed ports. And crucially, agriculture, which employed 90% of the labor force, was completely neglected. Then came 1979. Revolution. The Shah fled. The clerics took power. And everything changed. The new Islamic Republic had ambitious economic plans. They nationalized the entire oil industry. They nationalized every bank. They seized businesses and divided the economy into 3 sectors: state, cooperative, and private, with the state controlling the commanding heights. They introduced 5-year central planning just like the Soviets. But then came the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. For 8 years the country bled. Literally. Hundreds of thousands died. Oil infrastructure was destroyed. Production collapsed. Foreign workers fled. Estimates suggest Iran lost $500 billion through that war. From 1981 to 1989, GDP grew just 0.9% annually, the lowest of any period in modern Iranian history. When the war finally ended in 1988, Iran faced the monumental task of rebuilding. And for a while, under President Rafsanjani in the 1990s, they actually managed it. Growth averaged 5.5% as infrastructure was rebuilt and parts of the economy liberalized. But the fundamental problem never went away. Iran's entire economic model was addicted to oil revenue. By 1977, oil accounted for 79% of government revenues. And when you're that dependent on a single commodity, you're vulnerable. Vulnerable to price swings. Vulnerable to international pressure. Vulnerable to anyone who can turn off your tap. And in 2006, that's exactly what started happening. December 2006. The United Nations Security Council passes Resolution 1737, imposing the first international sanctions on Iran for refusing to halt its uranium enrichment program. At first, they're targeted, nuclear-related restrictions, some arms embargoes, asset freezes on specific individuals. But Iran doesn't stop enriching, so the sanctions get worse. 2010 brings a turning point. The United States and European Union don't just sanction Iran's nuclear program anymore. They go after the jugular, oil and banking. The U.S. passes laws targeting any foreign company investing more than $20 million in Iran's petroleum sector. The EU bans insurance on Iranian oil shipments, and without insurance you can't transport oil internationally. They freeze assets of Iran's central bank. The results are catastrophic. Iran's oil exports, which had recovered to about 2.5 million barrels per day, collapsed by half within 2 years. The rial loses 56% of its value between January 2012 and January 2014. Inflation hits 40%. Unemployment might be as high as 20%. According to U.S. Treasury estimates in 2015, sanctions made Iran's economy 15 to 20% smaller than it would have been otherwise and cost the country $160 billion in lost oil revenue. More than $100 billion in Iranian assets gets frozen in foreign bank accounts. Money that Iran can see but cannot touch. The Iranian middle class, the same group that had grown so rapidly in the 1970s, gets decimated. Research shows that sanctions led to an average annual reduction of 17 percentage points in the size of Iran's middle class from 2012 to 2019. Think about that. Nearly a fifth of the middle class erased. But here's where the story gets interesting. In 2015, after years of brutal sanctions, Iran finally agrees to restrict its nuclear program in exchange for relief. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA or Iran Nuclear Deal, is signed. Sanctions are lifted. Oil exports resume. Foreign investment starts trickling back in. For a brief moment, it looks like Iran might escape the trap. Then Donald Trump becomes president. May 8, 2018. Trump announces the United States is withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. Maximum pressure, he calls it. And he means it. Within months, U.S. sanctions come roaring back, harder, broader, more comprehensive than ever before. This time they target not just oil and banking, but Iran's entire economy. Petrochemicals, shipping, construction, mining, textiles, automotive, manufacturing. Even the central bank itself. European companies, terrified of being cut off from the U.S. financial system, flee Iran. Trade collapses. Oil exports plummet again from 2.5 million barrels per day to less than 500,000 by 2020. The rial goes into free fall. By 2020, the currency that traded at around 35,000 rials per dollar before the nuclear deal withdrawal hits 320,000. Then 500,000. Then 700,000. Today in January 2026, it trades at over 1.1 million rials to $1. That's a 97% loss of value in less than 8 years. But Iran doesn't collapse. It doesn't surrender. Instead, it does something far more interesting. It builds the most sophisticated sanctions evasion apparatus in modern history. When you're cut off from the global financial system, when your oil can't be sold legally, when your banks can't process international payments, you have two choices: give up or get creative. Iran chose creative. Very creative. Welcome to Iran's shadow economy, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar apparatus that combines centuries-old smuggling networks, cutting-edge cryptocurrency, shell companies scattered across dozens of countries, ghost fleets of oil tankers, and bribery on an industrial scale. First there's the oil. Iran still has it, massive reserves that need to be sold. But how do you sell oil when you're banned from international markets? You build a shadow fleet. By late 2024, monitoring groups identified over 477 tankers involved in Iranian oil smuggling, with 132 new vessels added that year alone. These aren't ordinary ships. These are aging hulks, often decades old, registered under flags of convenience in Panama, Barbados, Tanzania, Palau, countries with weak oversight. They operate with transponders turned off or spoofed, conducting ship-to-ship transfers at night in the middle of the Persian Gulf. They repaint hull markings, forge certificates of origin, and use fake documentation to pass Iranian crude off as Iraqi or Malaysian oil. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iran's most powerful paramilitary organization, controls much of this network. They've essentially replaced the National Iranian Oil Company as the country's primary oil exporter. And they sell the oil at a discount, several dollars below market price, to compensate buyers for the legal risk of dealing with a designated terrorist organization. Who's buying? Mostly China. Over 80% of Iran's smuggled oil ends up in Chinese refineries, particularly small independent teapot refineries willing to ignore sanctions for cheap crude. Iran's covert exports averaged 1.4 million barrels per day in 2023, the highest since 2018. That generated roughly $53 to $54 billion in annual revenue. Not bad for a country supposedly shut out of global markets. But selling oil is only half the problem. How do you get paid when you're banned from international banking? Enter Iran's shadow banking system, a parallel financial network built on currency exchange houses, front companies and informal payment channels that move billions of dollars while bypassing Western regulations entirely. Take the Zaringalem brothers, Mansour, Nasser and Fazlollah. These three Iranian businessmen control a network of exchange houses and front companies spread across the UAE, Hong Kong and China. Between 2023 and 2025, their operations helped launder billions of dollars from Iranian oil and petrochemical sales. They receive payments in foreign currency through shell companies, then convert and transfer the money back to Iran through a web of intermediaries so complex that even sophisticated banking surveillance has trouble tracking it. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned dozens of these networks, but new ones spring up constantly. One network shut down in Iraq was generating $300 million annually by blending Iranian oil with Iraqi oil at sea, then selling it as purely Iraqi in origin. Another network in the UAE used ship-to-ship transfers with sanctioned vessels, AIS spoofing, and nighttime operations to move hundreds of millions of dollars in petroleum products. This is an amateur hour. This is industrial-scale sanctions evasion, managed by some of the most sophisticated operators in the global underground economy. But the most fascinating adaptation? Cryptocurrency. Iran is now the world's fifth largest Bitcoin miner, accounting for roughly 4.5% of global mining activity. Why? Because mining converts something Iran has in abundance, oil and gas for cheap electricity, into something it desperately needs, hard currency that can cross borders without government permission. The Iranian government legalized crypto mining in 2019 and set up a licensing regime. Licensed miners get electricity at subsidized rates, sometimes as low as 1 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and must sell their mined Bitcoin to the central bank. The government estimates this generates around $700 million annually. But here's the twist. Up to 85 to 95% of Iran's Bitcoin mining is actually illegal. Unlicensed operations suck massive amounts of electricity off the grid, contributing to power shortages so severe that the government has repeatedly shut down all mining operations during summer heat waves to prevent grid collapse. And it's not just mining. In 2024, Iranian cryptocurrency exchanges processed roughly $4.18 billion in outflows, a 70% increase from the previous year. That's equivalent to about 1.4% of Iran's entire GDP flowing through crypto channels. Ordinary Iranians use crypto to preserve savings against inflation. The IRGC uses it to fund regional proxies and move sanctioned money. By the fourth quarter of 2025, IRGC-linked addresses accounted for about 50% of all crypto activity at Iran's largest exchange, Nobitex. The Revolutionary Guards moved over $1 billion through UK-registered cryptocurrency exchanges between 2020 and 2025 alone, using front companies and forged identities to bypass sanctions. When Nobitex was hacked in 2025, blockchain analysis revealed that Iranian government departments had been using cryptocurrency for international payments while simultaneously restricting ordinary citizens from doing the same. And it doesn't stop there. Iran has built an entire parallel aviation sector to smuggle aircraft parts and evade technology bans. Airlines like Mahan Air, officially civilian carriers, function as logistical arms of the IRGC's Quds force, transporting weapons and equipment to proxies in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Iran uses front companies in countries with limited transparency, Gambia, Madagascar, Kenya, South Africa, Myanmar, Cambodia, to purchase aircraft and components. They establish shell companies, transfer ownership through opaque registries, complete purchases in bursts of activity, and then use fictitious emergency landings to quietly route planes into Iran. A 2025 report from Israel's Institute for National Security Studies described it as a sophisticated integration of state, market and underground networks that operate in regulatory gray zones and disrupt efforts to globally enforce sanctions. This is economic survival through 1,000 workarounds. But while Iran's government and elite survive through shadow networks and smuggling operations, ordinary Iranians are experiencing an economic catastrophe unprecedented in the country's modern history. Let's talk numbers. Real numbers. As of late 2025, inflation officially sits at 42 to 48%, but food inflation tells the real story, over 64 to 72% year-on-year for basic groceries. Pinto beans tripled in price in 1 year. Butter nearly doubled. Rice, a staple of every Iranian meal, rose more than 80% on average, hitting 100% for premium varieties. Chicken is up 50%. Meat has become what experts call a luxury food item. One economist noted that to maintain even a basic middle-class standard of living, a family needs about 50 to 60 million rials per month. The official minimum wage? About 10 to 15 million rials. Not even a third of the requirement. The poverty line, officially set at around 6 million rials per person per month, is what labor activists call a line of death, not poverty. By early 2025, somewhere between 35 to 50% of Iran's 86 million people lived below the poverty line. That's up from 26% in 2022. In 3 years, nearly 20 million more Iranians fell into poverty. The government's own Ministry of Social Welfare announced in 2024 that 57% of Iranians experience some level of malnutrition. A field study published by the reformist daily Sharg found that only 2% of Iranian children consume dairy daily, while 50% receive none at all. Among households surveyed across 14 provinces, just 1.7% consume protein daily, while 26.9% consume no protein products whatsoever. Let that sink in. In a country with the fourth largest oil reserves on Earth, more than a quarter of the population can't afford to eat protein. The health ministry estimates that poor nutrition contributes to about 35% of annual deaths in Iran, tens of thousands of people dying each year from dietary deficiencies. Parliamentary research shows that by 2022, over half of Iranians consumed fewer than 2,100 calories per day, and with current food inflation, that figure has certainly worsened. And then there's the energy crisis. Yes, you read that right. Iran, a country sitting on 15% of the world's natural gas reserves and 10% of proven oil reserves, can't keep the lights on. Since February 2025, power goes out nationwide for 3 to 4 hours every day. Schools and government offices shut down to conserve energy. Half of Iran's industry has halted due to rolling blackouts. What? Because decades of underinvestment, corruption, international sanctions preventing technology imports, and aging infrastructure built in the 1970s have left the energy sector on life support. Instead of upgrading domestic infrastructure, Iran exports electricity and gas, a 92% surge in the first 4 months of 2023, because it needs the foreign currency. This is economic madness. A country rationing power to its own citizens while selling energy abroad because the government is so desperately broke it can't afford not to. The result? Mass layoffs, capital flight, brain drain. Between January and July 2025, businesses shed jobs at an alarming rate. Unemployment rose to 9.5%, up from 8% the year before. But even those with jobs found their income collapsing. The dollar equivalent of the monthly minimum wage fell from $180 in March 2025 to under $130 by September. Young, educated Iranians are fleeing in droves. Doctors, engineers, programmers, anyone with marketable skills. The Statistical Center of Iran reports that 41 million people of working age are without jobs, either unemployed or economically inactive. That means less than 38% of the working age population actually holds employment, and most of that is in low-income service and informal sectors. This is what it looks like when an economy doesn't just stagnate, it actively destroys the lives of its people. All of this suffering breeds rage. And that rage has been erupting. September 2022. A 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Jina Amini is arrested by Iran's morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She dies in custody. Within hours, protests explode across every province. Initially about hijab laws, the demonstrations rapidly evolve into something far more dangerous for the regime, calls for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself. Woman, life, freedom becomes the rallying cry. For months, Iranians from all socioeconomic classes, women, students, workers, even children, take to the streets demanding change. The government responds with brutal force. Human rights monitors report hundreds killed, thousands arrested. But the protests weren't really about hijabs. They were about an economy that had betrayed an entire generation. They were about watching your savings evaporate while government-connected elites siphon billions through corruption. They were about working full-time and still not being able to afford rice. The protests of 2022 eventually quieted. But the underlying fury didn't disappear. It simmered. Then came late 2025. Beginning December 28, new protests erupted in all 31 of Iran's provinces, including areas typically loyal to the government. This time they started with bazaar merchants and shopkeepers in Tehran, people being crushed by inflation and economic collapse. Then they spread to universities, to factories, to cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad. Unlike previous uprisings, these protests were explicitly economic at first. We can't afford to eat. Our children are going hungry. But as they grew, the demands became political again. Death to the dictator echoed through the streets. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said the government would speak with protesters but that rioters should be put in their place. The central bank governor was replaced. A new system of subsidies was announced. Human rights monitors report that between 36 and 45 people have been killed and over 2,000 arrested in just the first weeks. And here's the terrifying part. These protests are happening while Iran faces additional external pressures. In June 2025, Iran fought a 12-day war with Israel that saw Iranian military sites and even nuclear facilities struck. United Nations sanctions snapped back in September 2025. The Trump administration reinstated its maximum pressure campaign in early 2025, sanctioning another 875-plus vessels, companies and individuals in just the first year. Iran is being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. And something has to give. So where does this end? Iran stands at a crossroads, but every path leads somewhere dark. Option 1. Negotiate and surrender the nuclear program. President Masoud Pezeshkian, elected in 2024 on promises of economic reform and sanctions relief, wants to negotiate with the West. He knows the economy can't survive much longer under current conditions. The World Bank projects Iran's GDP will contract by 1.7% in 2025 and 2.8% in 2026, actual negative growth, not just slowdown. But Supreme Leader Khamenei has repeatedly rejected negotiations with the United States, calling America fundamentally untrustworthy after Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal. And he's not entirely wrong to be skeptical. Why would Iran give up its nuclear program again when the US already violated the last agreement? More importantly, the nuclear program isn't just about weapons capability. It's about leverage. It's the only card Iran has left to force the West to the negotiating table. Without it, Iran is just another poor Middle Eastern country with oil nobody's allowed to buy. Option 2. Full pivot to China and Russia. Iran has increasingly aligned with China and Russia, signing a 25-year cooperation agreement with China in 2021 and coordinating closely with Russia on everything from Syria to weapons development. China buys most of Iran's smuggled oil. Russia provides technology and diplomatic cover at the UN. But neither China nor Russia has shown any willingness to truly bail Iran out economically. China demands steep discounts on Iranian oil and won't provide the kind of massive investment Iran needs. Russia, itself under heavy sanctions for Ukraine, can't offer much beyond military cooperation. This path leads to Iran becoming a client state, permanently dependent on Beijing and Moscow's willingness to provide economic life support. It's survival but not prosperity. Option 3. Revolutionary reform. Iran could attempt fundamental economic reforms, breaking up state monopolies, reducing IRGC control over the economy, cutting subsidies properly, attracting real foreign investment, transitioning toward a digital economy. But this is political suicide. The IRGC controls massive sectors of the economy and isn't about to surrender them. The clerical establishment depends on patronage networks funded by oil revenue and state enterprises. Subsidy cuts, even necessary ones, trigger protests. The Iranian government tried raising fuel prices in November 2019, and it sparked the bloodiest protests since the revolution, leaving hundreds dead. Reform means destabilizing the very power structures keeping the regime in place. It's theoretically possible. It's practically suicidal. Option 4. Muddle through and hope. This is what Iran's actually doing, surviving day-to-day through shadow networks, cryptocurrency, smuggling, IRGC-controlled parallel economies, and just enough repression to prevent total collapse. It's a slow bleed, but it keeps the lights on. Barely. The problem? This isn't sustainable. Every indicator points toward worsening conditions. Food inflation is accelerating. The rial keeps depreciating. Oil prices are falling due to global oversupply. New U.S. sanctions keep targeting the shadow fleet. China's ports are increasingly refusing sanctioned Iranian vessels. The energy infrastructure is literally falling apart. At some point, something breaks. Here's the most tragic part of Iran's story. None of this was inevitable. Iran has some of the best educated people in the Middle East. It has engineers, doctors, scientists who've made contributions to fields from mathematics to medicine. It has 2,500 years of continuous civilization and cultural heritage. It sits on energy reserves that should make it one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Instead, it's become a case study in how political decisions, international pressure, corruption, and ideological rigidity can combine to create economic devastation that falls hardest on those who had no say in any of it. The Iranian government blames sanctions. And sanctions are certainly devastating. Research clearly shows they've shrunk the middle class, increased poverty, reduced GDP by 15 to 20%, and cost hundreds of billions in lost revenue. But sanctions alone don't explain the corruption. They don't explain the IRGC's takeover of massive economic sectors. They don't explain the government transferring pension fund debts to retirees in the form of worthless company shares. They don't explain exporting electricity while your own citizens sit in darkness. They don't explain spending over $1 billion supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon while 7 million Iranians go hungry at home. The Western powers blame the nuclear program. Stop enriching uranium, they say, and sanctions can be lifted. But from Iran's perspective, the nuclear program is the only thing preventing them from becoming Iraq or Libya, countries that gave up weapons programs and were later invaded or destroyed. And ordinary Iranians? They're trapped between a government that's failed them and international sanctions that are crushing them. They watch as both sides claim to have their best interests at heart while their children go malnourished and their savings evaporate. As of January 2026, Iran remains locked in a downward spiral with no clear exit. The economy is contracting. Inflation is accelerating. Poverty is spreading. Protests are growing. The government's budget deficit is exploding toward 1,800 trillion tomans. The rial just hit 1.1 million to the dollar and shows no sign of stabilizing. Meanwhile, Iran has built one of history's most elaborate systems for evading international sanctions. A shadow economy spanning oil smuggling, ghost fleets, crypto mining, front companies, and underground banking that moves billions of dollars annually. It's survival through 1,000 cuts, 1,000 workarounds, 1,000 small corruptions that keep the regime alive but leave the population bleeding. This is what it looks like when an oil-rich nation becomes the most sanctioned country on earth. Not overnight collapse. Not Hollywood-style regime change. Just slow, grinding immiseration that destroys the middle class, pushes millions into poverty, and leaves an entire generation wondering what their country could have been if different choices had been made 45 years ago. The question isn't whether Iran can survive under maximum pressure. Clearly it can, at least for now. The question is what survives. What's left of Iranian society after years more of this? What happens to a population where half the children don't get dairy, where meat is a luxury, where a university degree means nothing because there are no jobs? History will remember Iran's economic crisis not as a failure of sanctions or nuclear diplomacy, but as a humanitarian catastrophe that happened in slow motion while the world watched and both sides claimed the moral high ground. For the 86 million Iranians living through it, trapped between their government's ambitions and the West's pressure campaign, there are no good guys. There's just survival. 1 million rial dollar at a time. That's the real truth about Iran's economy. Not a story of heroes and villains. Just a tragedy that's still unfolding with no clear ending in sight. If you found this deep dive into Iran's economic crisis eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth analyses of how geopolitics and economics really work. We break down the stories behind the headlines that most people miss. Drop a comment below and let me know what country's economy you want us to investigate next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.